So Majesty of Reason responded to my response to his video on the Neoplatonic proof, or the argument from composition. I just want to say from the outset, thanks to Joe for his response, and I think he made a lot of good points that will help clarify misunderstandings we both may have and bridge the gap between Thomist perspectives and whatever perspective Joe is coming from. So let's just get straight into Joe's response.
I would only say that if it doesn't have the source of its existence in itself, it is evident that it needs an explanation by something other than itself. But an explanation need not come in terms of a cause.
So I clarified later in the video that I am interpreting this in terms of a creature having its existence or its source of existence in another. Now, maybe Joe wouldn't want to refer to this as a cause, I'm not sure, but I feel like that would just be semantics. If, as I'm ultimately arguing, every creature that has parts has its act of existence, its SA, in another, then all creatures that have parts have its act of existence in something that isn't composed of parts. If you don't want to call that a cause, that's fine, but my goal is to show that God exists. If there is this simple being which everything has its existence in, or which everything has a source of existence in, however you want to say it, then God exists. It doesn't matter if you don't call this relationship between God and creatures a cause, in my honest opinion.
Maybe he's going to go on to justify this, but I have to say, firstly, that a part of something is intrinsic to it. It's not outside of it. So something could still be independent of anything outside of it, and yet depend on its parts, because those aren't outside of it.
Right, so this is an interesting point, because Aristotle treats the parts as if they are outside of it in his argument in Book 7 of the Physics. Why would he do that if the parts are intrinsic to a substance? The reason, I think, is because Aristotle makes a distinction between parts and wholes. And of course, this is a standard Thomistic Aristotelian view. Phaser, for example, has a lot of material motivating this view in his response to reductionism. By in itself, I think what Aristotle is referring to is what a creature is, which is not identical to the parts if you reject reductionism. In other words, if a creature had the source of its existence/motion in its essence, then it would exist/move independent of anything outside of its essence. So I think that's enough to clarify what's going on here.
Also, another thing that we have to say is independent, right? We need to demarcate this. I say demarcate, I should have said disambiguate, right? We already saw how independent is ambiguous. It could mean logically or counterfactually independent, or it could mean a kind of causal dependence or metaphysical dependence or perhaps explanatory dependence. So maybe he's going to go on to disambiguate it. I hope he does. But we need to disambiguate this. We can consider, for instance, that God does not exist independently of the law of non-contradiction, say.
I am going to say that it doesn't matter what sort of dependence we are talking about, as long as it's a dependence on something that's actually really distinct from what the creature is. If a creature had its existence in itself, that is, in its essence, then it would necessarily exist so long as it has its existence. It wouldn't cease to exist once something outside of its essence stops existing. So if a creature does cease to exist once something outside of its essence stops existing, then it must not have its existence inside of its essence. This is really some of the same reasoning Phaser presents in his Thomistic proof. Now, Joe presents counterexamples, but as I argued, these are not examples of dependency relations to things outside of the essence of the creature, and so it simply is not a counterexample to any of my principles here.
I mean, I guess we could also say here that I don't quite see why this follows. Why couldn't it both be the case that a creature has a source of its existence or motion in itself, and yet it also exists and moves dependently on another?
Well, I suppose if you take source to mean an insufficient source, then that could follow, but if the source is sufficient to distinguish a creature from nothing, then the creature exists as long as it has that source, by definition. I've explained this in other videos, but I'm assuming Joe hasn't watched these videos, so I'll explain that I define existence as, at least in part, that which makes something different from nothing. Now, if there were two sources for the existence of creatures, one intrinsic and another extrinsic, then the existence of the creature, that is, what makes something different from nothing, would be the composition of the extrinsic and intrinsic source. But of course, I am going to argue, along with St. Thomas Aquinas, that existence itself cannot be a composite, because then it would depend on these parts for its existence, and it wouldn't really be what distinguishes something from nothing. Something else would distinguish it from nothing. And so there can only really be one source of existence.
There are a whole host of cases, whole panoply of cases, and this is commonplace in the philosophy of causation literature and other things, where you have causal or explanatory overdetermination, right? The creature could, firstly, have the source of its existence or motion in itself, but that doesn't preclude its having also dependence on other things for its existence and motion. It could be both. It could be both the case that its source or explanation of its existence, say, is both in itself and from another. There's nothing debarring that. It's similar to if one person, this is an unfortunate example, but you guys are going to have to forgive me. If one person is going to be killed on death row, say, and you have, 13 different shooters and they all fire their gun at exactly the same time and all the bullets hit, the brain at exactly the same time. Each bullet individually is sufficient to explain the dude's death. And moreover, each of them individually would be the cause or explanation of the dude's death. But nevertheless, they all, in some sense, causally overdetermine his death. Had one of them not happened, the other one still would have happened, and they would have killed him. And so in this case, you have multiple independent causes, each of which is sufficient to, explain the death of the dude, but they all work, right? They all are coming in and causing the thing. So we have a case of causal overdetermination. The death of the dude is causally overdetermined. It's caused by multiple things. And so this doesn't follow absence. Well, this is a non sequitur, this premise. You would need to say that there cannot be a case of explanatory or overdetermination here.
Okay, so one bullet is sufficient to kill a person, but multiple bullets cause the death of a person. So what's the conclusion here? The person doesn't die independent of the other bullets? Maybe there's a disconnect on our concepts of dependency here, because I don't see how that follows. I would say one depends on another when one would not exist without the other. Conversely, one is independent from another when one would exist without another. Now, in Joe's example, the death of the person would exist without any of the other bullets, save one. So the death of the person is independent of all of the other bullets, save one. Even if we admit all of the bullets equally cause the death of the person, it doesn't follow that the person is dependent on all of the bullets for his death, in the sense that he wouldn't die if it weren't for all of the bullets. And that's what you need, because my claim is not that if a creature had the source of its existence / motion in itself, then it would only be sufficiently determined to exist by one cause. My claim is that if a creature had the source of its existence / motion in itself, then it would not need anything outside of itself to exist. The creature would not cease to exist just because something outside of its essence ceased to exist. To make this more clear, say one specific bullet is in X, and all the other bullets are outside of X. If X has a bullet sufficient to kill a person and itself, then the person will die even if the bullets outside of X do not exist. This isn't perfectly analogous, so you could poke holes in this premise in relation to my original premise, but hopefully for the purpose of exposition, this helps you to understand what I mean. Given this, I don't think Joe's criticisms go through.
So I would also point out that I would grant that if something, say, doesn't have an explanation for its existence, let's say, quote unquote, internal to itself or intrinsic to itself, then it must have I would say this for contingent things at least, then it must have an explanation in terms of facts outside of itself, not intrinsic to itself. So in that sense, it would have, quote unquote, existence in another. I mean, maybe from another would be better here, or due to another. I'm not quite sure. A bit ambiguous with in another, or maybe not ambiguous, but unclear. So I would say that yes, if we have a contingent object on our hands and it doesn't have an explanation of its existence internal to itself, well then it must have an explanation external to itself. But that, of course, is perfectly compatible with it not having a cause, say. There are a whole panoply of explanations of things that are outside of themselves, that adduce facts outside of themselves, that make no reference to efficient causes.
Okay, I should note here, first of all, that I should have wrote source of existence / motion in 2 and 3 here. I mean, it's really a interesting thing because the way that I'm defining existence, it's sort of defined as source of existence. Because see, here's the thing: you can define existence as the thing that makes something different from nothing, or you can define it as the state of being different from nothing. I tend to define it in the way where exists is the state of being, or to exist is the state of being different from nothing, and existence is what makes something different from nothing. But if you define existence as the state of being different from nothing, then the source of existence would be what makes something different from nothing instead of existence itself. But I mean, this is just semantics. So I think Joe is misunderstanding my argument here, though. What I'm saying here is that the creature has its source of existence in another. I'm not saying there is a loose Humean connection between the source of a thing's existence and the creature. In other words, it actually has what makes something different from nothing, not in itself, but in another. If there is no relation between a creature and what makes it different from nothing at any particular moment, then it cannot exist at that moment. If a creature could exist without a relation at any particular moment to something outside of it, then it must therefore have what makes it different from nothing in itself. And I think this is ultimately what proponents of existential inertia have as a background assumption, that creatures have what makes them different from nothing in themselves. But this is precisely what Thomists are arguing against in the proofs for God's existence, so existential inertia is question-begging as a response to the proofs for God's existence. Incidentally, I think that in Joe's response to Edward Feser on existential inertia after he responded to him was based on a misunderstanding of what Feser was saying. He didn't seem to realize Feser thinks Aquinas' proofs, and I think the Aristotelian proof, is supposed to be along the same lines as the first way. Anyway, Dr. Edward Feser thinks that these proofs are actually demonstrations that existential inertia is impossible, because it shows that there has to be this sort of participation relation for the reasons I laid out above. Anyway, that's a side note. Let's continue.
First thing that I want to say is that the example is not meant to commit to something like, set theoretic realism. Rather, it's just to point out that in principle, there are perfectly coherent cases where you have detached from one another logical or counterfactual dependence from explanatory dependence.
Okay, I don't think Joe understood my objection here. And to be fair, I probably wasn't clear enough, so let me clarify. The way I was understanding Joe's argument is that it was a kind of reductio ad absurdum. Something like this. 1, if all dependency were causal dependency, then the dependency of God on the laws of logic would be a causal dependency. But this is absurd. God's existence isn't caused by the laws of logic. Therefore, all dependency is not causal dependency. But my argument, specifically, is talking about dependency on things outside of the essence of the existing things in question. And Joe wasn't responding to my position, but I'm showing how this criticism of Fazer's argument doesn't apply to my formulation of the argument from composition. My argument says if a creature had the source of its existence / motion in itself, then it would exist / move independent of anything outside of it. And then points out that a creature does depend on something outside of it, or its essence anyway, namely its parts. So I'm deducing what I would call a cause from a dependency on something outside of the being in question. I am not saying that all dependency is a causal dependency, and since I think these logical dependencies are actually dependency on things in the essence of the being in question, they are not counterexamples to my position that a dependency on something outside of a creature's essence requires a causal dependency ultimately. And again, this also doesn't apply because I'm not even saying that this dependency is a causal relation. The dependency of the whole on the parts. I'm not claiming that's a causal dependency, but just that it requires a causal relation. It means that the being in question must have its source of existence in another.
The second point that I want to make is that we don't even have to use this kind of example. There are a whole panoply of other examples that we could use. The property of being triangular and the property of being trilateral, right? These two things are, they're each logically or counterfactually dependent upon one another. You cannot have one without the other. It cannot be the case that one of them exists without the other. So there's a kind of logical or counterfactual dependence there. But nevertheless, neither of them seem to metaphysically or causally or explanatorily depend on the other, right? It's not as though something is trilateral because it's triangular, or it's triangular, or it has 3 sides because it's trilateral. It has 3 angles because it's 3-sided, or it has 3 sides because it has 3 angles. No, rather, both of those are explained by something more fundamental, namely the nature of a triangle, say.
Okay, maybe you could find an example of something outside of the essence of a creature, which the creature depends on, but which isn't a cause of the existence of the creature. I think even if we accept that, it still wouldn't challenge my argument, though, because what I'm arguing is that a creature which depends on something outside of its essence for its existence must have its existence in another. I am not arguing that every dependency relation to something outside of the essence of the creature has a causal relation. Again, Joe didn't formulate this argument against my position, so it makes sense that this wouldn't apply. But I just want to show you that you can still have a workable argument from composition in light of what Joe said about Fazer's argument. And if I'm not even trying to deduce that the dependency is a cause, then this alleged problem with Fazer's argument simply does not apply to my argument.
So, there are lots of things to say here. This seems firstly to assume hylomorphism. That's okay if TD is committed to it, but again, the point for present purposes is that the onus of justification is on proponents of the argument to be able to give detractors of the argument sufficient reason to abandon their position and accept the argument. So it's not going to be dialectically fruitful to pinpoint other examples of things within the proponent's worldview that they accept that would allow them to, let's say, get around a certain point or what have you. Rather, they need to give those who don't already accept those commitments either reason to accept those commitments, firstly, or secondly, sufficient reason to abandon their position on some other account.
Yeah, that's fine, but I don't even think that you need to defend hylomorphism necessarily. I mean, that's just my metaphysical framework for describing the fact that I think is pretty common sense that something continues to exist when you remove a part from a whole. I mean, when you cut off someone's arm, do you really think that the arm goes completely out of existence and then something just happens to come into existence that just happens to look like the arm? I mean, yes, it goes out of existence as an arm or as a part of the whole, but there's something about it that remains the same. I don't think you have to be a hylomorphist to accept this. I mean, it is a basic premise of physics, for example, that matter and energy is not created nor destroyed. That means matter and energy are conserved as the arm loses its actuality as an arm. And yet, most physicists who accept this are not going to be hylomorphists. And I mean, maybe you could interpret that in a way that would be consistent with complete annihilation of matter and energy, but I don't think that's normally what people are thinking. So I really don't think that my position here is very controversial, and so that's why I don't feel the need to defend it. I think I could defend it if I were pushed to, but I don't really feel the need to.
So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing that I would say is I'm not sure whether or not he's right that the parts would still exist without the whole. I mean, for instance, at least as I understand Aristotle, right? The hand that is cut off from my body and that's sitting over there on the ground, if someone were to take a machete and, cut off my hand, and it's sitting over there on the ground, that's not the same. That's not numeric. That's not the same hand that was earlier on my body, right? It's something different.
Yeah, but it's the same matter. The stuff that made up Grandma is still the same stuff that makes up the corpse of Grandma. So I'll quote Norris Clark on this. We have already shown in Chapter 7 on change in general that every change involves a synthesis of permanence and process, i.e., some metaphysical composition within the changing being of co-principles related as potency to act. Otherwise, the change would not be a transition at all, but a sheer sequence of two unrelated stages. A total annihilation of the first being and total creation out of nothing of the second being, which does not make good sense. We shall not redo this argument. Our problem that remains is more precisely what kind of intrinsic metaphysical composition is required in a being that undergoes such a profound change as to become a different being entirely. It must be some non-formal or formless principle, some real principle but lacking its own essential form. It is the matter which remains the same, and the forms which replace each other during the essential change. So under hylomorphism, the matter is what remains the same through the process of essential change. It simply is not the case that hylomorphists believe that matter does not persist through the process of change. We can say the same principle expressed by St. Thomas Aquinas here. A natural thing is what it is, not from its matter, but from its form. Wherefore, although that part of matter which at one time was under the form of bovine flesh rises again in man under the form of human flesh, it does not follow that the flesh of an ox rises again, but the flesh of a man. Else one might conclude that the clay from which Adam's body was fashioned shall rise again. The key here is to notice St. Thomas Aquinas holds that the same matter which was in the bovine flesh is also in the human flesh in the resurrection. It is the form that changes, not the matter. St. Thomas Aquinas addresses this more directly here. In the matter of things subject to generation and corruption, we must presuppose undeterminate dimensions, by reason of which matter is divisible, so as to be able to receive various forms in its various parts. Wherefore, after the separation of the substantial form from matter, these dimensions remain the same, and consequently the matter existing under those dimensions, whatever form it receives, is more identified with that which was generated from it than any other part of matter existing under any form whatever. Thus the matter that will be brought back to restore the human body will be the same as that body's previous matter. Finally, there's a great paper on the resurrection of human bodies I would recommend to everyone, and I'll quote a section here from that. Aquinas says that it is clear that the human being returns numerically the same both because of the permanence of the rational soul and because of the unity of matter. And I think there is evidence that he must mean at least some modicum of continuality of literally the same matter, in arguing that it is not a requirement that a human being's resurrection body include whatever has been in him during the whole time of his life. Aquinas says he needs to take up again from that matter only what suffices to complete the due quantity, while happily ensuring that resurrection bodies are not monstrously massive. This passage, more to our point, also seems to require that the matter assumed in the resurrection be taken from that matter which had belonged to the person during the time of her life. Furthermore, Aquinas includes in this article a detailed discussion of what matter gets restored to which people. Given that many people will have shared matter over the course of time, including via cannibalism, he holds to this basic principle. If something was materially in many human beings, it will rise in him to whose perfection pertains more, or it will rise in him in who it first existed. Applied, this means that the seed will rise in the begotten. The cannibal will rise with nothing received from his victims, when possible, and the rib, formerly known as Adam's, will rise in Eve. Setting aside the relative credibility of these applications, this principle clearly presumes some sort of continuality of the same material parts, even having passed through multiple transfigurations. Thus, it seems, everyone is promised at least some material part which belonged at one time to her ante-mortem body. Of course, the same matter could not have passed through multiple transfigurations, ultimately being reunited to the soul, if matter simply ceases to exist after the body no longer is united to the soul. So, in other words, yes, hylomorphism is totally compatible with the continuation of matter as it is united with differing substantial forms. Okay, I think that's all the points that I need to address. Thanks again for Joe's response. I hope that you watch this because I feel like especially the matter part is very important for understanding Thomistic metaphysics. Anyway, thanks for watching.